Thank you for joining us for the first episode of Fall 2021 of Distinct People, Distinct Time, where we have a conversation about congregational life in the 21st century. Today we do a fall intro with Pastor Scott Hand and Pastor Andrew Bradford and myself as we talk about how COVID has affected our leadership as pastors. Andrew and Scott, thanks for joining me as we kick off the fall season or the fall times where we will be sharing Distinct People, Distinct Time. This will be kind of an overview, and what we talk about today we'll pick up and go more in depth throughout the fall and talking about how we are approaching things. I made a statement several weeks ago in a sermon, and had said it in leadership multiple times, that we now live in a COVID world. People have repeated that back to me multiple times of how that resonated with them, and that kind of shapes what we want to talk about and how we've been approaching leadership and continuing iron sharpening iron between us and also helping the church understand how we're processing things and moving forward. So I just wanted to start. What is your first memory of, man, COVID's serious? What was it for you?
I think for me, it was that leadership team meeting we had that Thursday. Because if you remember, back in March of 2020, we had new member commissioning celebration planned for that following Sunday.
You're right.
And we had to make what I call painful decision to cancel that, or to at least postpone it. And so you had me go out in the parking lot and call Sandra Rice, who kind of oversees that, helps organize it. And I had to call her, and then she had to call everyone and tell them what was going on. So for me to cancel that, to make that kind of a decision, I thought, okay, it's not just going to fly by. This is something we're going to have to deal with. Yeah. So
I remember thinking, we're really going to do this. We're really going to not gather on Sunday.
Yeah,
that was pretty serious.
Yeah, all those things are there. You know, you're reminding me eating barbecue then for 3 months after that during COVID because of the leftovers. We'd already bought the food.
We already bought the food. Yeah, that's right.
For me, my earliest memory is walking in the lobby. Stone quiet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ever want to go back to that? Yeah. That was very, very hard. Follow-up question. When did you come to realize this isn't going away in the foreseeable future? When did that sit on you?
Man.
So I don't remember. What I do remember is late spring, maybe April. So we had been doing virtual services, if you call it that, for a few weeks. And that was because the world was upended. People are dying. We've got to take drastic measures. And we talked about how that can be a parenthesis, but that can't be life. Right. We talked about how the Chinese church, they don't stop meeting because of the government. They find ways to meet.
Right.
And I remember us talking about if this continues, we're going to have to find a way to meet. So looking into the spring, the temperatures starting to warm up, numbers were starting to go down. We were assuming an end of it late spring. Mm-hmm. We were assuming we were going to get back to meeting,
right?
But aware at that point that we couldn't keep going the way we were if things continued.
How about for you?
It's hard to remember too for me, like exactly the moment. I don't know if I had a moment, but a realization I had was in my personal conversations with people and even in meetings, language that just became everyday language. That, like social distancing, quarantine, stay at home, mask mandate, all this kind of stuff just became normal language. We all knew what we were talking about. We'd see pictures on the news or whatever, social media, that a year previous would have been the strangest picture in the world, or we wouldn't have understood what was going on, but it had become such common language now that I kind of thought, well, this might be here to stay, or at least not come and go quickly, because it was a part of our everyday life.
Right.
Language and pictures and things we had to do.
I think I kept being hopeful it's going to go away. It's getting better. But just this summer when we did the, we had camp, college retreat, and then we were there with the GCT, the Pathways retreat, and then boom, the last day people started getting COVID. That's like, okay, this thing's
not going away.
This thing's not leaving. So we've been asking this question now for well over a year. What implications does COVID have on how we do ministry? Now, I'm not talking about masks and vaccines and all those other things. I'm just, how do we carry out ministry in a COVID world? So what are some of the just baseline confusions too?
Yeah, maybe confusions.
Baseline conclusions you've come to?
I think what he just said, the church has got to continue.
Right.
This is not going to stop the church. We've got to figure out a way to gather.
Right.
We've got to figure it out. It's not just hunker down and wait for it to pass and then we'll resume life as normal. Because of what we're talking about, this is normal. We live in a COVID world. So figuring out the way to move forward, which we're going to get here in a minute, but growth groups were a huge part of that for Parkwood.
Right.
When we had to go virtual, when we had to start meeting outside in the parking lot, only having one service, groups continued to meet.
Right.
And we feel like that is what helped sustain everyone until we could resume gathering again. So focusing on relationships, but just figuring out how to meet. We have a responsibility, a God-given mandate to gather. And so figuring out how to do that.
Yeah. Emphasis on shepherding. I mean, I'm kind of playing off what you said, but shepherding doesn't depend on programs.
Right.
So programs can shift, programs can stop. Shepherding, disciple making, these things continue. Relationships. I mean,
and we kept saying, stay connected
right.
to growth group, identify yourself. And we know we've failed. I know there's people got to be listening right now going, well, you've forgotten us. It is a massive challenge. I mean, we're constantly discovering people or, again, if you're listening, I've said this so many times over the last year and a half, and we've not identified you, we're sorry, but tell us.
Yeah.
Tell us so we can correct that and move in the direction that we need to go. We did our purpose statement review, if you will, in August. We went back to that. So look, why did we do that? Why do we restate the purpose? Each of us preach a message, glorify, grow, and go, and then expectations. Why did we do that for? What was the purpose?
To remind us why we exist. I mean, with all the distraction, with all the fear that's out there, I think fear makes people do things that they wouldn't normally do.
Yes.
And so there's a fear of, there's health fears. I think there's fear of churches dying, of people not coming back, people that didn't, that were here, pre-COVID is another language or another word we use all the time. Well, pre-COVID, this, and this. So I think fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally do, makes churches make decisions they would never normally make. And so I think just refocusing us, here's what we're about. Here's what we've always been about. And COVID's not going to change that. Situations may change, programs may change. We're still going to glorify, grow, and go. I think that was the main reason we did it.
So you use big word. You said it exists. I was pondering this last night. Talking about existential, that we are here, we are living, we are being.
Right.
There's more than staying alive.
Right.
To exist does not mean just staying alive. We live and move and have our being.
Right. Exactly.
And that has to continue. And that's part of the biblical mandate as to what we do. And this is not the first time in history people have been faced with catastrophic things.
Exactly.
And how they moved forward. So, you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, similar thought, but it is our purpose.
That's right.
And so when things are in upheaval, you've got to be reminded of your purpose.
Yeah.
Because your purpose hasn't changed just because circumstances have changed. And our purpose is expressly and intentionally biblical.
Right.
So we're not trying to be creative, in which case circumstances or a different environment would then change your purpose. Our purpose is biblical, so it's always going to be our purpose, and we need to be aligned under that purpose.
So global disciple making, Pastor Andrew, how has COVID fundamentally changed the work of going with the gospel to all peoples?
Well, we've had to refocus in the same sense as what we did with our purpose, refocus where we are. Teams have changed. There's been some turmoil. Borders have been closed. So things have been through some transition. We've had to refocus where we are in Central Asia. Number one, that we are in Central Asia. We are focused and dedicated, committed to Central Asia. So refocus that. Having done that, though, COVID has compressed people's planning. Long-term planning.
Right.
we used to plan trips a year out.
Right.
International trips were booked a year out.
Right.
Our goal was to start having conversations no less than 6 months out. I mean, if we need to fill a spot, if something came up with it with the team, we were doing things, 3 to 4 months out sometimes. But our plan was never less than 6 months out. That's changed because people aren't thinking 6 months out now.
Right. So it's almost like we used to tell people have a passport ready. A tragedy happens and we have to call on you to go somewhere. Now you better have your passport ready because if the door opens,
that's right. We're planning on trips right now.
Go.
People have pulled their passport out. They've not had them out. Travel had been stopped for a while. Pull it out and realize it's expired.
Oh,
so
I just had a panic moment myself.
Maybe
I did the same thing.
Maybe mine
for this trip,
expired.
And mine is 2024. So I got a couple of years.
Okay, good. So, what strategies and plans do you have to move forward in this near future? What's on your mind?
Well, it comes back to the refocus of where we are, clarifying where we are in Central Asia, moving toward these teams, because these teams have been through the same things there that we've been through here, and sometimes to a greater extent because cross-cultural circumstances, or they've been out of the country and teams are reconstituting in their locations. But we want to refocus and be there for the team. So our next 4 international trips in Central Asia are retreat-oriented. We're there doing member care for the team.
Right.
Getting them together, preaching, leading worship, having them gather, helping them gather as a team, and doing the things we're talking about right now, refocusing, restarting. And second is mission exposure trips. This is an opportunity for people who don't understand missiology, haven't done missions, maybe haven't traveled. Yeah. It's a context of a trip, or it's a trip in a context for people who haven't done it before.
Right.
And so it fits because it doesn't require the long-term planning. It requires somebody being willing to go and figure it out.
Right. And you've had to move that from overseas.
Yeah. Prior to COVID, we had multiple locations picked out internationally where we would do mission exposure trips, and that has changed and slidden west. So our mission exposure trips are New York, where there are over 10,000 Central Asian peoples, and one worker with Global Gates that's focused on those 10,000 people. Right. So that's constituted about 5 people groups, but over 10,000 Central Asians, and we are taking a trip there in the spring, in March of 2022. So that opportunity is available. Another global city that is actually international, you do have to have a passport, is Toronto. And same thing, tons of Central Asian peoples. The unique thing about Toronto is the IMB has considered putting Central Asia personnel in Toronto. They haven't done that yet, but there are enough Central Asians to warrant that discussion. And there's no worker there focused on them. There are workers of other affinities there. So we are planning to go there in the spring as well. So.
Nice. Getting to the peoples of the world. Now, you talked about the workers. The workers are struggling. Some of them have been blocked out of their country. Some of them have been kicked out of their country. Some of them have not been allowed to get back in. Many of them that have been there have been literally locked down in apartments for months. Mm-hmm. I mean, the wear and tear on them is in some ways, and I would say for many of them, worse than it has been on us here. Yeah. So the one thing we can do is pray.
That's right.
So give us 2 ways to pray. It's on your mind.
Yeah. So they are still having to operate as a family. So one way, and this doesn't just come from me, I heard it from a worker. We are trying to send our kids to school and dealing with the same COVID situations that you're dealing with there. Mm-hmm. So navigating school, in person, COVID coming up, schools being closed, going back into the homes. So pray for families and schools. Pray for those relationships with the locals. They are still trying to share the gospel, and they are still trying to get with these people. So they're using social media and other things when they can't get with them face-to-face. Right. But we need to be praying that the gospel would go forth and that workers would be emboldened and passionate to share the gospel.
Amen. Amen. So let's think locally. Where do we need to currently focus?
Well, I said it earlier, but there's a broad answer. Growth groups in general,
right?
I think is because, like I said, that was one of our constants the whole time.
Right.
There's some groups that never stopped meeting.
Right.
Now they may have had to go to Zoom or whatever, but there were multiple groups that never stopped. And you talk to them today and they say, man, I don't know what I would have done without my community, without my group, without my brothers and sisters that I've known for years who I've been, in mission or on mission together with. They help, So God used it tremendously. So we got to stay focused there, stay focused on growth groups. But a strategic belief that I've always held is that one of the best ways to help your defense is with a good offense. And so what I mean by that is we're focusing on planting new groups, multiplying new groups, training up new leaders. As we push out, people may say, "Oh, well, we're in a COVID world. We just need to heal. We just need to slow down and this, and this." And I see why people say that, but I like I said, I think we got to be on the offensive. We got to go with the gospel. We got to multiply. We got to push people a little further than maybe they're comfortable. But it's it's to help them grow. And so, in light of that, we're holding we just had our first week last Sunday of new growth group leader training and host home training. So it's very exciting. We had 16 individuals in the class, or in the training. 19 were represented. Some husbands and wives couldn't, both of them couldn't come. So 19 people represented, and we're going to be starting some new groups in the fall. So very excited about that.
And we have to. I mean, if those that still are uncomfortable or can't because of your health, being here. The church is growing. We have new people every week, and I'm not talking about one or two, multiple families, all these houses being purchased here, their families coming, they've researched us, many of them, they know what Parkwood's about, what this church is doing, and they're excited, and they're looking for growth groups right away. I mean, it's, didn't you say there were 3 families that came to the picnic? Just to connect with groups.
Well, that's who I personally talked to. But
I talked to some others as well.
Andrew talked to some. Pastor Mike talked to some. I mean, we had multiple new families who were not connected to a group. Some had been coming to Parkwood for a while, and just hadn't yet connected. Others were new to Parkwood, but they came, which I was so encouraged. They came and just said, "All right, where do I go?" Or a friend invited me, so I'm gonna go to their group. But that was amazing. So people are coming.
And the same thing is happening in student ministry and college ministry and kids ministry. I mean, all these groups are growing everywhere, and the need to prepare and raise up leaders is crucial. Now, let's talk about something very specific. Lainey Greer joined us, Women's Disciple Making Associate. We'll go into depth on this, but one of our tasks is to, what it says in the title, making disciple makers. And in the conversation, we don't just want to focus that on women. We want to focus on men and women. So there's a plan in place coming forward for how to train disciple makers. And what are we calling it?
The title now is Disciple Making Essentials, or for us IMB folks, DME. So we're going to call it, Jeff. I know you hate that, but I'm getting it public now. Because we like acrostics, acronyms.
No,
baby.
Disciple Making Essentials. I'll correct you too every time you do it. So the basic structure is we're going to have men and women.
Correct.
Right?
There'll be a track for men, track for women.
Track for women.
Correct.
Now here's where people may panic. So how long will this take to do?
It is a 2-year program divided into 1-year segments. So 1 year and 1 year, they can be taken separately. There's not a specific order. You have to take year 1 or year 2. It's not that. But it is a 2-year program. That is the idea. That's how it's being developed.
Yeah, and we're going to limit the number of people through applications.
Correct.
Because we want to be able to teach and people to learn. So we'll start a group on year 1, then next year that group can keep going in year 2, and we can start another year 1 group. And develop people along.
But there's a unique thing to it, though. It's not just you show up to class and you listen to a lecture for an hour. It's because it is about making disciples. And so this is what I love about it, and this is why I think we're so excited about it. Is because the structure will be week 1, you come as a student and you listen, you learn. But then week 2, you are tasked, and you're not going to be able to take it if you're not committed to doing this. You're going to then go and teach what you learned to 2 to 3 other people. during that off week, during that
Right.
second week. Then in week 3, you come back and learn. Then week 4, you go back and teach those same 2 to 3 people.
Right.
So throughout the course of that first year and then into the second year, you are not only learning and growing as a disciple, but then you're making disciples of 2 to
Right.
3 other people.
Right.
So that's intense. I mean, that's going to be, we're raising the bar, which we're going to talk about that here in a minute too.
Yeah.
But so that's the unique dynamic to this. But I think that's what's exciting.
So somebody could be sitting out there thinking, and we're going to do an entire podcast just on this, but just briefly. Somebody could be thinking, how in the world would it take 2 years for you to teach me how to teach somebody else?
Right.
It's what you're learning that you need to teach somebody
Right.
else.
Correct.
So what are some of the subject matters we'll be dealing
Correct.
with over these
So-
couple of years?
We'll be dealing with biblical theology,
What in the world is that?
It's basically how the whole Bible fits together. It's the story of God's plan and love, redemptive plan for His people. How the Bible fits together.
Yeah, okay.
That's the nutshell version. Systematic theology we'll be teaching, which is individual doctrines, the doctrine of God, doctrine of the Holy Spirit, doctrine of salvation, things like that.
We're getting at what you believe.
Right, correct. Both
How
those
can you
things
make
are-
disciples if you don't have foundational belief? All right,
Exactly, right.
go ahead.
And then we'll spend some time on the spiritual disciplines. Donald Whitney's book will be a major textbook, if you want to call it that we'll be using. But that's, Bible intake, prayer, scripture memorization, fasting, service, worship, things like that. We'll be heavily focusing on evangelism as well, with some apologetics in there. Just what are some cultural things that we need to be aware of, and how do we address them as biblical Christians? And then we're also going to be talking about some counseling, meaning how do you relate to people?
Right,
How do you teach people?
right.
Right? Because we live in a world where, I don't want to get into too much other, but Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, the autonomous. I mean, there's some things we need to know about how to deal with people, how to deal with modern people.
Right.
So there'll be some of that thrown in there, very practical aids about how to deal with and relate to people.
Yeah. So people get involved. We'll do a whole podcast on it, but they'll get involved by applying, and that'll be coming up later on in the fall. And when we do that podcast, Lainey will be with us and weighing in on what she brings to the table, because she has brought a ton to the table as it relates to this. Now, here's what's fascinating. We were reading this book, Deep Discipleship. We want to end by talking about it a little bit because it's influenced a lot of things. While we were talking about repurposing, getting back to the purpose, we were educating ourselves, trying to raise the bar in our own lives as pastors and leaders here. And Lainey comes in, we're talking about this disciple. She's mapping things out, and we're all looking like, have you read JT English? No, I hadn't. So it's very fascinating. She was saying the same things. You had already gone down the path of some of the things in this book, and we're not going to get into all of it. But Deep Discipleship by JT English, let me just give everybody listening a brief feel about what the book is about. He says, Deep Discipleship is about giving people more Bible, not less, more theology, not less, more spiritual disciplines, not less, more Christ, not less. He says, if we could think through a philosophy of ministry that helped people grow and mature into deep and holistic disciples, that's what we need to do, is to think through how do we do that. And then he says on this page, it terrifies me that people may enjoy the sermon, participate in small group ministry, volunteer on one of our teams, and be completely satisfied with their experience, yet be spiritually apathetic toward the person and work of Christ. We just don't want people participating here. Right. We want to make disciples who make disciples. So how was this book helpful to you as a leader in this local church at this particular time? Scott? You're the local disciple making pastor. How did it help you?
I think just from the top down, structurally thinking about disciple making as a whole at Parkwood, thinking about that, not because what you just read, he's addressing a problem in the church. Young people grow up and they leave the church. We have apathetic people that show up on Sunday. We can't get people to serve, not necessarily Parkwood, just the church, as a whole. Right. And so he's saying, in response to that problem, we've dumbed things down.
Right.
We think, we got to make it simple so people can grasp it. Right. And his argument in the book is, no, we got to go deeper. They got to fall in love with Jesus deeper. Right. They got to grow more as a disciple, and that's what's going to spur them on to not leave the church or to be on mission. And so that idea has been transformational as I'm thinking through discipleship, kind of as a ministry at Parkwood. And so right along with that, I have to read this quote because we've talked about raising the bar, and it's coming from page 133. He says, one of the most important things you can do, this is as leaders in the church, is start raising the bar for your people. That sounds counterintuitive. We inherently think we need to put the cookies on the lowest shelf if people who are not yet mature disciples are going to have access. But the opposite is true. And this line right here, disciples will never rise to an expectation the church does not set. That I don't want to be a church where we are setting the bar so low.
Right.
We have to raise the bar. We have to set the expectation that we expect you to be a holistic, deep, mature, growing disciple. So for me, it's been good.
That's a good word. How about you? How did it impact you?
Well, actually, I think I first picked up the book as a result of one of you saying you should read this.
That's funny.
And my thought was another book on discipleship. So I started reading it. And very early on, his premise is, so suppose your pastor has to come from your congregation, your next pastor. So how do you, so we all think of disciple making, and we all think of, training and theological education, et cetera. But his extensive, and you said as a whole, his extensive and holistic approach.
Right.
In other words, kind of a double entendre there, the idea that it is extensive and holistic in terms of the congregation, it reaches everyone.
Right.
And in terms of from beginning to end, that you're talking about a mature disciple. Yes. Someone you could see as a pastor, not just, they know their Bible, which can be different. So
no, that's good.
I thought it was an
really
excellent
good.
book.
Yeah. We're going to talk about challenges, but we're about out of time. So if you'd like to hear more about this book, let us know. Maybe it'd be a worthy podcast to just talk about deep discipleship. Even though it is mainly directed at church leaders, I do recommend people in the congregation read this. It'll help you understand why the things we do at Parkwood and the things we will be doing are crucially important. You recommend it as well?
Oh, absolutely.
Wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
And I've been telling other pastors, hey, you need to read this book. You got another quote that
it's right along the same lines, but it's just ringing true. Like he says on page 171, people don't graduate from discipleship.
Yeah, that's good.
He says they are commissioned into further discipleship. And it is important that you begin using language like this. When people finish a Bible study, a core class, a training program, a residency, they don't graduate, they are commissioned. There are no graduates from learning spaces, only commissioned participants. And so I just think, we have to not make people or allow people to think I'm going to come, sit through a class, sit through a training, check off the box, and I'm done.
Right.
No, they're commissioned into further discipleship.
That's right.
So it's just that's
why I love his challenge toward passive learning, but that's another discussion.
Yeah.
I'll answer this question and go back to the last one. Why would I recommend this book? And kind of the quote question. He asks hard questions. So
he does.
He addresses a discipleship inventory. He says, go through a few steps. First, what spaces does your church have for discipleship? You might ask this of your person, of your life. Right. Second, are these spaces functional or dysfunctional? Third, what spaces are missing in your discipleship pathway? And fourth, there's not a fourth, that's it. What spaces are missing? And then in that is, it's not listed as a fourth. In that, then you categorize essential and functional, non-essential and functional, essential and dysfunctional, non-essential and dysfunctional, essential and non-existent. You don't ask this of your church or of yourself if you're not willing to know the answer and do something about it.
Right.
So the book's very helpful in that regard.
Yeah. So making disciples is not, we've always done that.
That's right.
And particularly in the world that's changing this fast, you have to be asking, what is the best way to go about making disciples? So you alluded to it. I'm going to read this as we draw this to a close. What if the next lead pastor of our church or the next women's director is not yet a Christian? Am I providing opportunities for them to hear the gospel, respond to the gospel, be formed by the gospel, then learn to communicate the gospel, all in the context of the local church,
Right.
then he repeats this sentence, 10 times. The local church is the primary place that God intends to make and form holistic disciples.
Amen.
We should not have to say, oh, you need to go to seminary, you need to go to Bible college if you want that. We should form holistic disciples within the context of the local church, which means it's not just on us. We're the primary leaders in that, but we have to raise up other leaders, leaders of leaders.
That's right.
And to think that the next pastor is coming in and hearing the gospel for the first time, I'm thinking about students over the next few weeks that we're clearly going to walk through the gospel. I'm thinking about that. Maybe the next pastor is going to be sitting in there in high school, listening to the gospel for the first time. And how are we going to shape and mold them? That's the challenge. That's why we get up every morning. That's why we love what we do. And we love being a part of Parkwood, because Parkwood cares about this. It's not just us. And I look forward to further discussions as we go deeper into these things. Thanks for joining us today.
Yep.
This has been an episode of Distinct People, Distinct Time, a ministry of Parkwood Baptist Church, where we exist to glorify God by laboring together for the growth of all believers while going with the gospel to all peoples. You can learn more about Parkwood by going to parkwoodonline.org, and you can find resources like this one from the church by going to parkwoodresources.org.